I've seen some of these movies so long ago that I was tempted to say, do I need to rewatch some of these movies? It's been so long.
Yeah, I know. I had the same feeling, but I decided that would be a little crazy, so
Yeah.
I'm just
And
winging it.
also the fact that I moved on to the next list and like I have thoughts of like the other like lists we're doing. I'm like, my head is all jumbled and like, what, wait a minute, what are we doing? We're
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
did I watch all these movies yet? But um, but yeah, I mean, I enjoyed all of these movies. The funny thing is, like, I've all but one of these movies I've seen already multiple times, some varying from like dozens to like a couple of times. Uh, but context always matters when you do anything or when you process anything. And I think with the context of watching these and how they relate specifically to slasher movies, it paints a different picture on how I view these films. Because in a different context, I view these films differently. Some of these films I've already reviewed for my channel previously, but watching them in this context, I have a different opinion on them, if that makes sense.
totally, totally does. Yes.
Yeah. So obviously, we're both familiar with the slasher genre or subgenre. Uh, do you want to take the lead this time in breaking down to viewers who may not be familiar with it, or would you like me to do that?
Well, I can make a couple of comments, and then you can throw in whatever you think you should throw in as well.
Okay.
Um, but I just want to start by saying that the slasher genre is probably one of my favorite genres of all. I have been watching slasher films since I was very, very young. I don't know why, but they've always appealed to me in a very big way. And I used to, when I was very young, I wasn't able to go to the theater, but I was able to see some of them on TV and also the TV movies that were kind of influenced by the slasher genre. But I just couldn't get enough of that genre. And I think that somebody once said that the slasher genre is one in which the audience knows, even before they start watching one of the movies, they know exactly what's going to happen in this movie. They know everything. And in fact, not only does that not bother them, but they actually get upset if the movie deviates from that template and becomes something else. They really want to see that formula that they've come to expect in a slasher film. And I think I can certainly feel that in myself as well. There's something in the slasher film that really appeals to me. It really speaks to me the way maybe romantic comedies speak to somebody else, you know? And that's another genre that has a very distinct formula that you kind of know before you start watching what's going to happen. But yeah, slasher films for me are probably, if not my favorite, they're certainly within the top 3 or 5 of my favorite genres of all time.
I think it's interesting that you frame it that way. They're almost like a roller coaster ride. It's you know what you're getting on a roller coaster. You're gonna go up slowly and you're gonna build that anticipation. Then you're gonna go down and it's gonna be a thrill. And then you just kind of ease off and you're just like, wow, that was amazing. And I think that's what this is. It's just a wild ride. You know what you're going to get. And it's not a matter of like, are they going to show you anything new? It's just a matter of how are they going to execute this? What is the execution going to be from these things that I'm familiar with? You know, you're going to see a lot of people get killed, but how creative are the death scenes? You know, you're going to see a lot of beautiful women. Are you going to see any boobs? Or is it just going to be cutaways or, love scenes and things like that? And yeah, I think I agree with you in that aspect, in that if you deviate too much, you kind of disappoint your audience. And it's funny that you say that as well, because the recent Halloween movie that came out that ended the trilogy, I think it was Halloween Ends. I thought it was interesting and I liked it, but there was a lot of backlash because, again, it wasn't a matter of like, is this good or bad? This is not what we expected, was kind of like the outcry for why people didn't like it, because the people that defended said, hey, I like what they did. The people that didn't like it didn't say necessarily it was a bad movie. It was more so like this deviated too much from what I was expecting and what I was hoping for.
Yeah, I heard that kind of thing. I actually haven't seen that movie. I was kind of disappointed in the reboot Halloween, the first of the three films that they made. I know a lot of people loved it, but I was kind of disappointed in it. So I didn't see Halloween Kills and I didn't see Halloween Ends. Maybe I will at some point, but I heard a lot of negative things about Halloween Ends, I must say.
Yeah, I think this is the third reboot of the franchise, which is insane that these movies are being rebooted so many times. And this trilogy of films is the third go around. At minimum, it might even be more, but I know it's at least the third time they've just started over to a certain extent because they are using the same characters, but it's kind of relaunched completely.
Mhm.
And I watched the middle movie in the trilogy because I reviewed it, and I watched a third one only because I heard so much different things about it. Of like, oh my god, like it drew my interest, the backlash. And since we're talking about it, might as well give a quick review of my thoughts on Halloween Ends. So I I like the fact that uh there was subversion of expectations, and that's kind of a taboo thing, especially with Ryan Johnson and the way he handled Star Wars. And when people hear that, they kind of cringe, like, oh god, subversion. But I think the subversion worked here because for I am not a huge fan of the Halloween franchise. I think it's one of the weaker ones. I think the first one was a very self-contained movie and it could have ended there. I didn't really care too much for the second, but it was just kind of a continuation. I think it was like the same night. And then the third one, I thought it was interesting if it would go in that direction of just being some different horror movie that took place in Halloween. And just the fact that it happened on Halloween would be the theme as opposed to following the same characters. But I am not as big of a fan of the franchises that follow the protagonists as much as I'm a fan of the franchises that follow the antagonist. And to me, to keep bringing back Laurie Strode, it's just like, come on, she's a grandmother, like she's an old lady. She'd probably break her hip if she actually had to chase around like a regular person, much less this supernatural killing machine. So to me, that aspect of it was ridiculous. But I will agree with fans of the franchise who are a fan of these characters, these legacy characters, in that it was promoted as this showdown between Laurie and Michael and this final battle. And that's not what the movie was. It was almost like, hey, this is the same town, the same setting, a lot of the same characters, but we're almost starting over in the sense that here is the new Michael Myers. Here's his character with this tragic backstory who turned into a serial killer. And I kind of liked it. I mean, there were certain aspects of it that didn't make sense. I think the bullies were like a school band as opposed to like school jocks. It's like they weren't very intimidating. And it's just like, why even go in that direction? That's too much subversion. So the bullies weren't really that intimidating. But I did like the new antagonist, and I thought that not having Michael Myers in it at all would have been great. Even when Michael showed up, I thought maybe even having him in the background would be great. But to me, when it fell apart was when it's just like, okay, now let's just get this character that we developed and we spent the whole movie focusing on. Let's just kill him and get him out the way, and now focus on Laurie and Michael. And I can see how that would frustrate people, is because if you're someone who's like, all right, give me something new, well, then they kind of just said, screw the new stuff in the third act and let's just focus on Laura and Michael. And it's just like, if you were here for Michael and Laurie Strode, then you were just waiting until the third act. So it's just like they tried to please both sides, but ended up pleasing no one because it was just kind of like all right, who were we supposed to be following? Who's like, who are we supposed to sympathize with? But overall, I thought it was a decent movie. I did enjoy it. I was entertained. I think these slasher movies are more about entertainment. They're not about fine art. So was it a great movie? No. But was I entertained? Were there some interesting death scenes? Did it go places I didn't expect? Yes, yes, yes. So for me, I liked it, but I can clearly see why no one was pleased because they didn't really pick a direction where they wanted to go with this story, and yeah, it's just trying to please everyone, and you ended up pleasing no one. But overall, I was entertained.
Wow, that's interesting. I'll definitely have to check it out at some point. But I know I felt disappointed in the first of the trilogy, the first film, because the idea, as I understood it, was they erased all of the sequels. So all we have is the original Halloween, and that's all that happened. And they're talking about Michael Myers as if he's this incredibly notorious serial killer, but he really only killed about 5 people in one night if you erase all the sequels. So that didn't make sense to me. Why do people care about him? Speaking as someone who's worked on these true crime documentaries, there's a lot of people who killed 3 or 4 or 5 people and we've never heard of them. Like they're just lost to time. So I don't know why Michael Myers would be this big deal in the reboot if you erase all the sequels and he really only had that one burst of killing.
Yeah,
But
that's the one of the trilogy that I didn't see because frankly, I wasn't going to watch any of them until I decided to review the second, and then curiosity got me to watch a third, but I didn't see that one. But I've never been a fan of the franchise. I've just been a fan of the first film itself. Since we're already talking about Halloween, let's just go into that for the first review. So
sure.
these are the top 10 essential slasher films. They're not the best. They might be, but we're not viewing them way as like, all right, let's just pick the best 10, like based on our preferences. Like, what do we think are the 10 movies that are the best that can be categorized as slasher films? These are more so the essential ones, where it's like, if you can only watch 10 and you wanted to get a sense of what slasher films are, how they're best represented, and what could be an entry point, these are the 10 to watch. And Halloween is part of that list. We've already talked about the fact that it's been rebooted at least 3 times, and there's plenty of sequels, even one that just came out last year. Let's just talk about the original, which is originally called, I think, The Babysitter Killer or something like that, or that was an alternate title. But that was kind of the focus, was just babysitters. There were 3 babysitters that I think were the main characters that were stalked in the heart of the film after you got through the prologue when Michael was an adult. And I do think that was a theme of some of these early slasher films when babysitting was more of a thing back in the 80s, where you would just go out and hire some teenager to watch your kids. I don't have any kids, so I don't know if that's like a thing anymore. I think now people just put their kids in front of like a smart device and then just leave. But whatever the case is, your thoughts on the original Halloween, the movie that
Well,
started.
yeah, that is one of my all-time favorite movies. I love that movie. I saw that movie on TV when I was a kid, when it first aired, and I just loved it. It blew me away. I watched it every time it came on. I eventually rented it, and then I bought a VHS tape of it as soon as I could. I've watched that movie so many times, and I would agree with you that in a way the rest of the series is not as interesting or as good as the first movie, although I did enjoy some of the other ones. But I think the first movie, I would say it's a masterpiece. It's really a brilliant movie, and it kicked off the genre, and it was ripped off by so many people. But what really blew my mind is that most of the people who ripped it off didn't seem to get it because they did other things. Instead of having a killer, in Halloween, we know who the killer is, right? We know it's Michael Myers. He escapes from an asylum, and there's no question about that. But most of the other slasher films, they tried to do them as a mystery. You know, who is the killer? We don't know. You know, and it's like a completely different format in a way, if you know what I mean. And having Sam Loomis, the psychiatrist, who's trying to get Michael back or stop Michael from hurting people, you know, most of the other films did not have a character like that, who was kind of like the heroic figure who was trying to chase down the killer, which, you know, really kind of upped the excitement level for me, that there's somebody who knows about him, who talks about him, and is pursuing him, you know, and it's not just a bunch of random people in a cabin in the woods getting picked off one by one with no real story, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
So Halloween, I thought, was just, it was brilliant. And even though it was copied so many times, I felt that nobody else really got it right. They never really recreated what made Halloween great.
Mhm. Yeah, let's talk about some of the things that make this a slasher film and some of the things that became staples of the slasher genre based on Halloween. There's a lot of stalking in this movie. This is heavy on the stalking. I think most of the runtime is just Michael watching and following and creepily being behind these teenage girls. You do have the sex, you do have the virginal girl that's the main character. And I want to talk about that specifically. Now, even people that I respect immensely tend to harp on the fact that, oh, well, part of this genre is the virginal, pure person that doesn't have sex is the one that's going to live. And I've never believed in that. These films are not high art. People making these films aren't saying, okay, yeah, let's make this about purity and like not having sex. No, every movie has a central character. And in almost every movie, that central character has certain traits that make you want to root for them. This is the good guy. This is the pure at heart person. Any genre you go to, even when you talk about comedies and you have like Bill Murray and Adam Sandler who play complete jerks, at the end of the movie, what happens? It turns out they have a heart of gold, you know, and they do the right thing. You know, it's to me like playing on the morals in this slasher and trying to make that seem like it's somehow important. To me, that never made sense. Morals are played with all genres, and you have even with Star Wars or any genre you want to go to, that puritanical lead character is something that is synonymous with every type of movie and every type of story you're gonna tell. Do you agree, or do you feel there is actually something to this?
No, I agree with you. I think that it's become a way of viewing the films, but it's not really, I don't think anyone had that intention. And I think that what you're saying is absolutely right. But I think also it's because everybody was ripping off Halloween, you know, so they thought, well, hey, we have a virginal nice girl here in the lead role. So they kind of decided, well, that's what we need for our movie as well. You know, they're just kind of ripping off what's already there in a way. So I don't think any of them thought, oh, we're going to make a statement about morality or anything like that. I don't think so. I think it's a way people read the films. And I think there are plenty of examples where the lead character is not a virgin. And you know, there are people who do have sex and do survive. You know, I don't think there is, you know, it's not cut and dried.
Yeah. And other aspects of this film that, again, the stalking we talked about, the puritanical lead character, the fact that it's a lot of females generally being stalked in these movies. I think part of that too is one, to titillate. You know, a lot of teenage boys are going to be watching these type of films. That's kind of your audience. And I think even women, I don't think view a man stalking or following another man as being something that's like super scary, because that's kind of like in a certain aspect, it's a level playing field. I think in these type of movies, when you think of someone taking advantage of someone else, you more so think of like a man being more physical, taking advantage of someone less physical, like a woman who is, in danger, the woman in peril. I think that's synonymous with other genres as well, but that's definitely a staple of this genre.
Absolutely, and I wish I could quote this more exactly, but I think that Hitchcock had a theory about this, did he not? About putting a woman in peril sort of gets the audience really into the movie. Something about a woman in peril, and I think it's kind of what you're saying, that if he's a man, if he's a big, strong football player, people are going to be a little less concerned about him when another guy comes along and starts messing with him. But if it's a small woman who isn't, she's maybe like Laurie in Halloween, she's like a bookish, good student. She's not an athlete, you know. She's somebody you're going to worry about if she's being attacked by a guy who's bigger than her and stronger than her. And I do think that's part of why I remember one of the criticisms of the genre being that they kill a lot of women and they kill more women than men. But somebody did the research and they found out that actually they kill just as many men get killed in slasher films, but they tend to get killed quickly, whereas the women tend to take longer to kill. And I think part of the reason for that is, again, if you've got a male character who's a big, strong football player, you probably have to kill him quickly before he knows what's going on, or else he might turn around and kick your ass, right? But if it's a small woman who's half your size, maybe you can take your time and terrorize her a little bit and chase her around. So I think there is a certain aspect of that going on in these movies.
Absolutely. Other aspects that are synonymous, the stalking, the women in peril, the final puritanical girl. You also have the edge weapon. And I think that has to be a part of it. Obviously, slashing, you need an edge weapon as your main weapon. And I think that makes the kills more creative. If you have someone with a gun or some kind of weapon that's going to kill people very easily, then you don't have as much of the tension of like the back and forth and things like that. So definitely the edged weapons are definitely a big part of it. And Michael definitely has the butcher knife, the masked killer. He has the William Shatner mask, obviously, that's very famous. So those are just a few of the elements. You also have the extended POV of the killer, which is in that famous opening sequence as well. I'm sure there
Yes.
are several more we can name. Is there anything else you want to touch base on as far as the tropes or things like that before we kind of shift focus to something else?
Yeah, I was going to mention the POV shots, which are very crucial, and the masks. And also, the killers in those early slasher films tended to be silent, right? They're silent, brooding killers who don't ever talk. We don't know what their personality is like. They're just these shadows, these figures. Now, that changes a bit later on, thanks to Freddy Krueger, perhaps, but we'll talk about that later. Um, but I agree with you, guns, every once in a while there is a gun used in a slasher film, but it is a very rare thing. And if you made a movie about a guy who killed 12 women with guns, we probably wouldn't call it a slasher film. It probably wouldn't feel right. It wouldn't be the right kind of movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't
So,
have as much tension, so it'd probably be more of like a thriller or something like that, because you don't
yeah,
really have all that buildup of, the escaping and, the dress gets torn, but she doesn't get killed, or like a little
yeah,
cut and the chasing and all that stuff. So
yeah,
extending that stuff, as opposed to just shooting and killing, kind of
yeah,
makes it more of a horror film. So.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and as far as the movie itself, I agree with you. An all-time classic. Love watching it. I love the sit up when she's like, "Oh my God!" I was like, and she's catching her breath, and you see in the
Yeah.
background he just sits up.
Yeah.
It's just like, whoa. And
Yeah.
obviously, that's a big part of pop culture now. For those who are fans of like The Undertaker, he's obviously used that, the wrestler, where he just sits up a lot and just like, uh-oh, I thought
Yeah.
I beat this guy and he's still alive. and that obviously iconic ending where they think Michael's dead and then they look down and there's no body. What a
Hmm.
perfect way to end the film. To me,
Yes.
if this was a standalone movie, perfect.
Yeah.
Didn't need a sequel, didn't need to know why he survived, how he survived, where is he, are they going to survive? You didn't need to know any of that. But
Yeah.
honestly, if they were going to continue it, my preference would have been he kills them off at the beginning of the second movie and we just have a new set of characters every time,
Mm. Yeah.
but that's me.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Fair enough. I agree. The ending is brilliant, when he's just gone. And especially when you pair it with the lines like, was that the boogeyman? As a matter of fact, it was, right? And he sort of becomes, in that moment, he becomes a myth, right? He's this mythical figure because Loomis has been describing him throughout the movie as this guy who's pure evil. He's not a man, he's not normal. And so when he vanishes into thin air like that, he just becomes a myth, he becomes the boogeyman. And it's a perfect ending. And I feel, again, all the other movies ripped it off, but they didn't get it right because what they would do is they would just have the guy sit up, just at the very end of the movie, he'd open his eyes or he'd sit up. But there was nothing even remotely mythical or supernatural about a lot of these other guys. They were just rednecks in the woods with an axe, and they would just sit up at the end for no reason. It didn't work as well. But Halloween really got it right.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So now that we touch base on one of the greater films in the genre, and there's a lot of great films on this list we have, I'd like to maybe take a step back, like way, way, way back to one of the movies like I never even heard of before we decided to do this. I only heard about this movie when I started researching. I'm like, 13 Women. What is this? 13 Women made in 1932. I'm like, get out of here. And I kept just trying to avoid even looking at this film or the title or anything like that. Because even the posters, I'm like, this is supposed to be a slasher? Get out of here. And it kept popping up. So I'm like, you know what? Let me just do a little bit more research on this. I'm like, you know what? Maybe this is a film we should have on the list. And then when you were like, yeah, let's put it on, I was like, you know what? All right, fine. I thought this would probably be like something that I would say, you know what? This probably doesn't qualify as a slasher. Let's leave it off. But honestly, this 1932 film, it's a slasher. Not only is it a slasher, it's a prototypical slasher. There's a lot of things in here that's just beat for beat everything you would expect in a golden age slasher or a modern day slasher film. And I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, and I thought it fit into the category of slasher films far more than I thought it would.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. It is surprisingly like a slasher film. And a lot of the ideas that become sort of iconic, for one thing, it's about a sorority, right? It's about a bunch of former sorority girls who are getting killed off because of something that happened in the past, which is something I maybe should have said about slasher films, is they often are about something that happened in the past and it's coming back to haunt the people in the present day.
Well, we
You
couldn't
know?
say that with Halloween because it didn't really have that as a focal point. So, but yeah, with this one, it definitely did.
Yeah. So, because of some incident that occurred, all these sorority girls are getting bumped off. I suppose where it's different, though, is that it's not really about an edged weapon, as you mentioned before. It's more about supernatural or what might be supernatural
The power of
killing.
persuasion.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's a little bit different in that way. It's not overt in terms of butcher knives and axes and stuff like that. But in terms of a body count movie, if we think of it that way, 13 women.
The title says it all, right?
Yeah.
Talk
That's
about
very
body
much,
count.
yeah, it's very much what slasher films would become about, for sure.
So this was based on a book, but if it wasn't, I'd have a lot of problem with this title because there weren't 13 women in the film. And I thought, like, first thing I thought was like 13 women in one of these 30s films that are like 70 to 80 minutes long. Like, are you gonna kill like a woman a minute or something? Like, how are you gonna get to 13 women? So
Yeah.
I was surprised that the about by the title, but obviously based on a book has more time to get into all these characters. The movie only focuses on revenge on like a couple of the girls, and then you focus on the main character that's being stalked and stuff like that. But you do have the backstory with the past, and this character was wronged by another group of characters that she's now going after, and we find out in time why she's going after them and such. But I thought this movie was so dark. The first about 10 minutes, I'm like, holy crap, this is a dark, bleak film with like people killing themselves and just like, kids. And it was just like, wow, I was shocked at how dark it was. But it was a pre-Hays Hays Code film, so that probably had a lot to do with it as well. But I thought the beginning of this movie was a lot stronger than once it started focusing on just the Irene Dunn character, the main character. Then I think it became just kind of conventional type of a movie. But the first act of this film was just amazing to me. I thought I was in for like a hell of a ride. Overall, still a very good movie, but just I was just shocked at how bleak and dark and twisted this whole film was to start. You did have some things we should mention that can be problematic in this day and age.
Half-breed type. Half Hindu, half Japanese, I don't know.
You have a white woman putting on tanned makeup and slanty-eyed mascara and stuff like that to play an ethnic woman. I think she was supposed to be half Asian and Indian or something like that.
Half-breed type. Half Hindu, half Japanese, I don't know.
But she was just 100% white. So if stuff like that offends you, then you may want to stay away from this. But if you can just get past that as something that's part of the error, I definitely think it's 100% worth a watch. And like you said, with the sorority stuff, the killer being someone from the past attacking a group of people that wronged them, and the tragic backstory, all of that stuff definitely plays into modern day horror films and modern day slasher films specifically as well. But I think overall, if you can get past that part, definitely worth a watch. It starts off stronger than it ends, but it's still a very short film. So it's not like you're slogging through anything. These were in the days where there was no third act. So once the climax comes, the end comes like a few minutes later. So definitely, I think, worth a watch.
Yeah, I agree. It's for anyone interested in slasher films and the history, definitely worth watching. Also, for people who like pre-code movies, it's definitely worth watching. And yeah, ultimately, probably most interesting because of that. Because it is a weird, really early example of a slasher film. That's probably what makes it the most interesting. But that is reason enough, I think, to give it a look.
Let's get into another classic. Again, let's get into some of the pre-Golden Age stuff with Psycho. I think a movie that everyone's heard of. And you definitely have all the elements there for a slasher film. The famous shower scene, which never gets old. No matter how many times I rewatch this movie, that shower scene really stands the test of time. For me, it's not even the killing part that really like gets to me. It's the eyeball shot after the kill that's just amazing to me. But you have a master filmmaker here in Hitchcock. Again, don't research Hitchcock too much because there's a lot of stuff that's problematic about Hitchcock, how he treated his actresses, did he go too far and things like that. But again, if you can leave all that stuff aside, obviously it's a classic film. We don't need to tell anyone else watching this that it's a classic. But specifically with slasher, I think 100% a slasher. The twist of the main character being killed halfway through the film, brilliant. The portrayal of the Norman Bates, great. The twist at the end, I mean, obviously, a modern day audience member who doesn't know the twist can probably see it coming, but I think for the time, a very good twist, one of the most iconic twists in movie history. Um, all of that adds up to a great film. The only small knocks I give it is there's a lot of like exposition at the end, kind of explaining everything, and you wish they would have weaved that into the story a little bit more instead of just like dumping everything at the end. It's just like, could you have found a way to maybe like tell his story or some of that in the context of what we're watching instead of just literally a guy like reading it off to us, at the end. A minor gripe. Great movie though.
Yeah, absolutely. A masterpiece. And in terms of, if we think of Halloween as the movie that launched the slasher genre, Psycho was a huge influence on Halloween. There's no doubt about that. John Carpenter cast Jamie Lee Curtis, who was the daughter of Janet Leigh, who was in Psycho. And he named the psychiatrist Sam Loomis, which is a name of a character in Psycho. And I think that there are also moments in Psycho that you could say are very much, I don't want to say he copied them, but I think he was influenced by those moments. In particular, I would say when the one character decides to go up to the house and she's walking to the house, and we know what's in the house. We know that this is not going to be good. It's just like in Halloween, where Laurie is phoning across the street and nobody's answering the phone. And then she decides, well, I'm going to go over there and see if they're okay. And she crosses the street, and it's all in real time. And I suspect that that was very influenced by that moment in Psycho. And interesting too, we just talked about a pre-code movie in 13 Women, because Hitchcock had to fight with the Hayes office to be able to do some of the things that he did in Psycho. And it sounds ridiculous, but there's a shot in Psycho of a toilet where she throws some evidence into the toilet, and apparently the Hayes office did not want the toilet to be shown. And so he had to really fight with them about that. And it's one of the reasons why the Hayes office really lost a lot of its power after, because Hitchcock had won these fights and Psycho became such a huge success. And I think the Hayes office, it was kind of the beginning of the end for them. But the movie's totally brilliant. And it's also the first movie we're going to talk about, which is based on a book, but it's based on the true life serial killer, Ed Gein or Ed Gein. I'm not sure how you pronounce this.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's totally based on the true story where he killed his mother and all that stuff. And there's a lot of the ideas you can see in Psycho were coming from the true story. And this is not the only movie we're going to talk about today that's based on that true story. Very different movies, though. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Psycho, it's a must watch for anyone, whether you're into slasher films or not. I would say it's a good enough movie that it must be seen.
Yeah, absolute classic, and one of the great movies in Hitchcock's filmography. And yeah, a must watch. You don't need us to tell you that Psycho's a good movie. If you do, then God, I can't help you. Another film from 1960, another all-time classic, another film that it's kind of surprising that it's in this genre, maybe to some viewers, because there's a lot of people that I know love this film, even the person that introduced me to it, who would never be caught dead watching actual slasher film that's like from the golden era or after, is Peeping Tom. This is a film that I think film scholars watch and film historians watch, but also falls into the category of this subgenre of gory, tit-laden, popcorn movies. But for me, this may be my favorite movie on the list, because especially when you're just looking at it in the slasher movie category, the development of the character and his motives, this film really takes you deep into that, and it makes you kind of understand where the character is coming from. And for me, emotionally getting involved in these movies for me, this was number one, that as far as like where I felt part of this character's journey, and it felt like more of a serious movie. We previously talked about Psycho, which is a great movie, but it's not necessarily a serious movie. It's more sort of like a great movie that's well executed, that has a nice twist, that was well crafted. And I think a lot of these movies on this list are going to be that, or they're going to be really good popcorn movies. But as far as just like something that's just like a great movie, I think this is number one for me.
Yeah, this movie's brilliant. I love this movie, and I think I first read about it in a book where they basically said that this movie came out the same year as Psycho. It deals with a lot of the same issues, you know, voyeurism, etc. And yet, Psycho was critically acclaimed and very successful. And this movie, Peeping Tom, was so critically savaged that it basically destroyed the career of the filmmaker. He basically did not survive this, even though the movie is now recognized as a brilliant movie. It is now considered a masterpiece, but at the time, the critics just didn't like it. The critics, it made them uncomfortable in some way. And I think it's a testament
because
to
it's a hard movie to watch. I mean, it's, it's very uncomfortable.
It's you know, it's the quality of the movie that makes it so uncomfortable. They, you know, he did a brilliant job with it, and it made them feel something that they didn't like to feel, I guess. But yeah, I think it's a brilliant movie for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this character is a bad person. He's a very bad person. And the movie makes you understand he's a bad person, but it also makes you sympathize with him. And you see how much he's struggling with what he's going through and how much he wants to change, but he can't. And it really dives into the void, like you said, the voyeur aspect of the film, and a lot of POV stuff that is very synonymous with the slasher genre. You get a lot of that POV stuff. You get a lot of the beautiful women being photographed and stalked and killed. This movie is just brilliant. The cinematography, the shot where he's above on the by the ceiling, and then the pen falls out of his pocket, is just a brilliant shot. There's just so much that's just brilliant about every aspect of this movie. It's so well crafted. You knew like the filmmaker cared about every scene, every frame, every shot, and it shows and it pays off. And you're right, it did kind of, Michael Powell, I think, is the director.
Yes,
but it did ruin his career. It's a shame, but at the same time, you're grateful that you have this piece of art still around. And for me, this would probably be my favorite film that I've rewatched that's on this list. Again, a lot of great films on this list, but for me, this is the essential one. And if you had to watch one, I would say this would be the one to watch. Again, there's a lot of different types of films that fall into this genre, but as far as something that's character study, great cinematography, great direction, great acting, set design, everything serves a purpose in telling this story. Everything you're watching is leading you to the same direction. There aren't things that happen by accident. Things that happen by accident can be brilliant as well, but everything has such a purpose. And I just think this is just a brilliant film.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think, unlike Psycho, I think we do have to tell people, watch this movie, because this movie is not as well known as it should be. This movie should be up there with Psycho. It should be a classic, but I think most people haven't heard of it. You know, they don't know about it, and they should. Mm-hmm. So, yes, go out and find this movie and watch it. It is one of the best movies in the genre. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why it's not as popular as Psycho and some of the other films on this list, it doesn't have that popcorn feel. Like, some of it's kind of uncomfortable, you know? It doesn't have like, oh my God, like, look at that shower scene. Oh my God, he's the mother. Like, you know, it's like, you don't have those type of moments. It's just a lot of uncomfortable scenes and a lot of like nicely well executed stuff, but you don't really have a popcorn moment in this movie where it's just like your popcorn flies out your lap, you know, or like a great twist where it's like, oh my God. No, you know he's a killer at the beginning, you know he's a killer at the end, you know he's everything you know at the beginning, you know at the end. There's no new piece of information. It's just a matter of following the journey and getting a deeper understanding of how a psychopath becomes a psychopath. And yeah, just brilliant execution.
Yeah. I think one of the reviews I read said something like a powerful portrayal of a life destroyed. And I thought that was a good way to describe it, because you really see how he became what he became in this movie.
We just talked about 2 movies that came out in 1960. Let's talk about 2 movies that came out in 1974. We'll start off with Black Christmas. This film has a huge cult following, and it's one of 2 films, maybe 3, I guess you could technically say, that uses the whole phone call from the killer trope, and 2 specifically where the killer is in the house, which was a popular thing to use back in the day, and as far as with ghost stories or campfire stories, and used, I think, for the first time in a movie in this film. That was a big part of the twist. When you know the twist is coming, and it's pretty telegraphed, even if you don't know the twist is coming, it's like at some point you figure it out. So stretching that out, I think kind of, for me, kind of hurt my viewing. Even if I didn't know it was coming, the execution of it kind of dragged. It was just like, all right, we get the point. The killer is in the house. We kind of get that. But it dragged on for like, I think like too long in the film. They harped on it like, oh my God, when you see this twist coming, oh my God. It's like, no, we kind of see it coming. You don't have to cut about 10 minutes of this sequence and your movie would be a lot better. But again, this movie was very early in the slasher genre. It's a low budget movie. So you kind of don't want to view it with a modern day lens, because you're going to look at it and say, well, I've seen a lot of movies executed a lot better. Well, those movies had a chance of decades of knowing the formula and then knowing what to learn. And so you can't judge it from a modern day lens. You more so have to judge it as like a time capsule of like, this is 1974, and picture yourself not knowing all the stuff that came after it. It's more of like a pioneer movie. Again, important to watch because of when it came out and the meaning it had. But overall, not a greatest of movies you're going to watch, and probably lower on this list for me than some of the other films we're going to talk about.
I actually really like this movie, and it works for me. But I think in terms of, again, talking about Halloween being the movie that kicked off the slasher genre, Halloween is very influenced by Black Christmas. And there's a story that Bob Clark would tell. And I mean, I don't know how much of it is true, how much of it isn't true. But he said that John Carpenter told him that he was a huge fan of Black Christmas. And at one time he was sort of pitching Bob Clark on the idea of doing a sequel to Black Christmas. And Bob Clark says, well, how would you do a sequel? And Carpenter said, well, I would have the killer escape from the asylum on Halloween. And if that's true, then that is the genesis of Halloween, right? That's the story of Halloween. But regardless of whether that's true or not, the famous POV sequence at the beginning of Halloween, which really influenced the genre, it's also in Black Christmas. There's the POV sequence at the beginning of the first murder that happens in Black Christmas as well. And there's little doubt that Carpenter took that idea and used it in Halloween. And I think also the idea that, hey, this is on Christmas, this is on Halloween, you know, that's kind of a connection there. But the other thing is, when you think again about sororities being a big setting for slasher films, this movie is probably, well, it's certainly, aside from 13 Women, which, you know, is much older, this is a sorority house slasher film 4 years before Halloween really kicked off the genre. So you do see a lot of the things that come later, and I love it. I think that there's a lot of stuff in this movie. Again, because the slasher genre didn't really exist yet, they take their time with a lot of things, and there's a lot of interesting scenes. You know, like the house mother. You know, she's an alcoholic and she's hidden alcohol all over the place. And when the father of the first girl comes looking for her because she's gone missing, you know, she's doing her best to hide all the evidence that his daughter might not be the pure, innocent girl that he thinks she is. And there's a lot of comedy.
That's why she died. She wasn't pure enough.
Well, you know, maybe. But you know, there's all these moments in there that are kind of wonderful comedy bits. Even though it is a very serious movie at the end of the day, it is a dark movie, and it has a very open ending, which apparently Bob Clark, the director, later said that he regretted the open ending. But yeah, I just love it. I think that it's a movie I could watch every Christmas, and I think that there are a lot of people who do. And it's partly the atmosphere, you know, it's the atmosphere of it. It's just the feel of it. It just somehow really works for me.
Yeah, I two things that definitely stuck out to me watching this is Margot Kidder. She had serious issues with substance abuse. So it's kind of weird and uncomfortable watching her play a character that has serious issues with substance abuse. It's like, you know, it's like foreshadowing for her real life and how it would tragically end. And the other thing of note with this film is the theme of an event or a time period setting off the killer. And you would have during the golden era or age, which would come a few years after this, where people will be trying to snatch up as many events as they can to market their film. And this was one of the first, if not the first, that did it with Christmas. Because what do we have? There's Christmas, there's Halloween, there's Easter, there's, you know, there's New Year's, there's graduation. It's like you're trying to grab an event that is relatable to people, that you can put in your title, that's going to be the thing that triggers the killer and makes him go back on this killing spree. And this, I think, might have been the first with using Christmas.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
The other film from 1974, a much more popular film for me, to me, the better of the 74 films, even though I did like this one, the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. Now, this is one of the films where I heard about for a long time before I actually watched it. And for me, this is, for the movies on this list, this was my best viewing experience because one, I had the buildup of hearing about this low budget film. It's like supposed to be all creepy, hearing about it for a really long time, and then actually going to a video store with a bunch of my buddies. We had a bunch of brewskis and we're looking in the video store, what are we gonna get? We picked this one and we watched it together in the dark with some booze, a couple of my buddies, and it was just amazing. Just the atmosphere of being around like-minded people, watching this terrifying movie that you've all heard about but never seen. And it was one of the most scariest movie experiences of my life, because for me, what makes this scary is the fact that there is no budget. The fact that it has this documentary feel, like, you know, you're watching a movie, but there's something about this movie that makes you feel dirty and uncomfortable, and it adds to the realism, just the location shooting. I interviewed John Dugan on one of my podcasts many years ago, and he talked about like how uncomfortable and how hot that summer was that they shot in Texas and everything they went through. And it really shows through. Like, this is one of the most creepiest movies you can watch because it's, everything about it is very uncomfortable. And yeah, one of the scariest movies I've ever seen, one of the best movie experiences I've ever had as far as horror movies go. And I think this is definitely one of the greatest horror movies ever made, much less slash movies ever made.
Yeah, I agree with you. What's interesting for me, though, is that I grew up hearing about it, and it actually came and played in one of the theaters at one point, but it was restricted, so we could not get in as kids. So we finally rented this thing when it came out on home video. And the famous thing that you hear people complain about is that when we watched this on home video, the image was so dark that you couldn't see anything. Like once night falls, the next 40 minutes of the thing, it was like a black screen. You just couldn't see what was going on. And you could hear screaming, you could hear the chainsaw, but we were just so disappointed that we weren't seeing, gore or whatever. And then it was years later when I finally saw a good print of the film, and it was like night and day. Literally, I could see what was going on. And while there wasn't that kind of gore that maybe we were anticipating as kids, it was just a really scary movie, And it's somebody once described it as it starts off kind of slow, and then it just starts tightening the screws. And it just keeps tightening them and tightening them and tightening them until it's almost unbearable. And I think that's a good description, because it really does become more and more intense as it goes along. And it is very powerful and effective, I think. It's a great movie. And this is the other movie, by the way, that was influenced by the real-life serial killer, Ed Gein, however you pronounce his name. Mm-hmm. And obviously they picked up on different aspects of him than Psycho, because I think one of the things that he did is he actually wore the skin of some of his victims, which I guess is where Leatherface, the iconic character, maybe where that came from. He's kind of wearing the skin of some of his victims. But and I think also just the some of the production design, maybe with the furniture in the house. But anyway, I'm not sure. In any case, two very different movies, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho, but both based on that same real life serial killer, which I find fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the one aspect of the film that I think makes it great, but also gives it a little knock for me, as much as I love this film, there's no story at all. There's no plot. I mean, they go out, brother and sister with a couple of friends, I guess, to go see the father's gravesite in the house because there's grave stealing or whatever, grave robbing going on. That's about it. To me, that's a positive because it gives it more of a realistic feel. You're not watching something with a plot. You're just following characters with this roving camera around them, documentary style. But for me, the third act, you kind of feel like, man, this is missing something to tie everything together. Where it's just like, okay. Once she gets caught, and it kind of drags a little bit. So I will say that the third act it drags just a little, just because there's no story there to like piece things together. It's just like, all right, it's kind of meandering to an end, and it just kind of ends. But that's the only slightest knock I'll give it. And for a first-time viewer who hasn't seen it, just bear that in mind, that you're watching you're just following characters documentary style. It's not really like a movie where it's just like a beginning, middle, end, plot twist, setup and stuff like that. It's just you're following people and some fucked up shit happens to them and then it ends, So
yeah. Well, and it's worth mentioning too that this movie has been incredibly influential. I don't know how many times I watch a movie, and I mean some of them just made last year, and you watch and you go, oh, this is another version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's just another, people in a car and they wind up in some remote place and, oh, there's a guy here killing people. And, you can just see how the parallels are there. And you're right, they don't really have much story beyond that. It's just a group of people in a place running into a killer,
And a lot of times it's even closer to than the plot than that. They're not running into a killer, they're running into a cannibal family. I think
Yes.
wrong turn. That whole franchise is just basically people in a car driving around running into a bunch of cannibals, and
Yes.
that's an entire franchise that's also been rebooted, much like the Texas Chain Saw Massacre itself, where it's just an entire franchise
Yeah.
has been rebooted based on the same
Absolutely.
stuff.
Yeah. And again, all of these movies that copy it, and yet almost none of them are anywhere near as good, right? They've got a perfect model of how to do this, and yet they can't seem to get it right. They just copy it, and it's not as good.
Very unpopular opinion because I know a lot of people hate this film. Over time, people hate it more and more. But for me, the only movie that came close to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the Blair Witch Project. I know a lot of people don't like it, but it has the same feel. A bunch of characters, no real plot, and a very documentary feel. That's literally is a documentary where they're just trying to get realism in it as opposed to trying to make it movie-ish. And for me, my first viewing of the Blair Witch Project was great. I know a lot of people don't like it. A lot of people I respect hate it. But
Yeah.
for me, that's the only movie that ever came close to emulating the feel of. It's not as good. I'm not saying it's as good, but it's the closest to an original film that had the same feel for it.
Yeah. That's interesting because it's a totally different story. I would never think of it as, a copy of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I hear what you're saying.
I'm not saying it's a copy of it, but I'm
No,
saying
no.
it's the blueprint is the same.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
just something
No.
without a story, documentary feel,
Yeah.
small group of people, a tragic ending, and just fucked up shit happening to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I can see the comparison there. And I will admit that I was disappointed in the Blair Witch Project when I first saw it. And I haven't seen it since. So someday I will give it another shot. But it just got so much hype. And people were telling me, oh my God, it's the scariest thing I've ever seen. I'm sleeping with a baseball bat next to me now. I'm so afraid. Don't go and see this before you go camping. And so, of course, I went to see it with a couple of friends. And we just kind of went, it's not that scary. Like, why is everybody telling us it's scary? It just didn't work for us. But maybe if we hadn't had that real buildup of expectation, maybe it would have worked better. I don't know.
Context and expectations have a great way of judging, of you shadowing, of how should I put this? Of they really frame how you're going to view things. I mean, you can love something or hate something purely based not on the thing itself, but just based on expectations.
Yes.
And context. So, but again, most people I know, most people I respect have your opinion. I liked it though. I even had one of my good friends, good filmmaking friends as well. He said when he watched it in the theater, he literally got up and said, "What the hell did I just watch?" And he had a long conversation with almost everyone else in the theater. They just all collectively came together talking about how crappy this movie was and what the hell they just watched and what the hype was about. So yeah, most people are in your boat, but I like it. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's not get sidetracked on a movie that's not on this list. We got plenty of other movies left on this list.
True.
So I think we're kind of done, for me, with the serious movies, with the great movies, with the artistic movies, and now we just left with a lot of the popcorn stuff, which is not a bad thing, but I think the rest of this list is mainly just popcorn movies. And I think let's just get into another movie that's from my childhood, Child's Play. This is one of the movies that I watched as a young kid, and it just freaked me out. Maybe because it was how old I was. I was probably around that kid's age, maybe a little bit younger. And yeah, this movie was really freaky for me. And the whole the whole tagline in the trailer, I think they put it in the movie. Let's be friends to the end. This is the end, Chucky. I don't know, man. Again, I love this movie. Again, part of it, it's context. It's when I saw it. the age I saw it, the atmosphere, the setting, everything just worked perfect for me. And this is one of my favorite popcorn movies. I know it's very silly, and the franchise just gets sillier and sillier, to watching like grown adults holding up a puppet or a little doll and running with it, and then pretending like it's gonna kill them. And at least they don't do that in this film, but I've seen a lot of the sequels, and it's just hilarious where you see these wide shots of these guys holding up a doll saying, oh, acting like they're scared of it, but it's just a doll with his legs flopping around. The only truly silly part of this movie, which I didn't understand at all, maybe you can add some perspective for me with this. There was a knife Chucky was using towards the end of the film that was clearly a toy knife, but he was using it as if it was real, because it even had like a squiggly blood line on it that was like fake, like a fake blood thing. And I'm like, this is a toy. First of all, like, why are the Chucky dolls coming with fake like knives for little kids? And two, why is he acting like it's a real knife? Because during the middle of the movie, he actually had a butcher knife. Like when he was trying to kill the cop in the car, he had an actual butcher knife. But then later in the film, he had the Chucky toy knife, which it didn't make any sense for me, but it kind of took me out of the movie because that's all I could focus on. It's like, stop trying to kill people with a plastic knife, you know? But aside from that, again, to me, this is just a fun popcorn movie. It's super silly. It's dumb in a way that this little toy doll is killing people. But for me, the friend to the end line, the part where the mother realizes there are no batteries in this thing, you know, it's just like some of those scenes are just like iconic to me, you know. So, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I loved it. You know, I saw it in the theater when it came out, and I loved it. And I think it's an effective suspense film. And I think where it works the best for me is in the early part of the film, where it's kind of like, you know, is the doll alive, or is the kid doing this stuff? You know, there's sort of a question there that maybe the kid is doing this. The kid thinks the doll's alive. And, you know, the cop is sort of looking at the footprints and going, well, that could be the kid, you know. And they kind of do a good job of not showing us what's really going on until we finally get the big reveal where Chucky comes alive. And I found that moment to be actually kind of scary, you know, when he first came alive and he starts swearing at the mother. And, you know, that moment kind of freaked me out when I was a kid. So, yeah, I think it's an effective film, and I think it, you know, obviously launched a huge industry. I mean, not only a bunch of sequels, but a TV series now, and you know, so obviously an important film just for that reason. But also, it kind of had a new idea in that it's not a person; it's a doll, right? It's a doll doing the killing. And in answer to your question about the knife, I honestly don't remember that. I'm not sure if I've ever noticed that, but I wonder if it's something to do with the fact that they say that the longer he stays inside the doll, the longer his spirit is inside the doll, the more he becomes real, like the doll is becoming human or something.
So the knife is becoming real too.
Maybe, you know, maybe the toy knife is becoming more real. I don't know. That's all I can come up with off the top of my head. But
it was very distracting. It was very distracting.
I'm gonna have to take a look for that next time I look at it.
Yeah, it's literally it's clearly a toy knife, not a toy knife in the sense that, oh, it's not good, like the movie's trying to make a real knife look like a toy knife. No, it's a toy knife in the context of the movie. That is a toy knife. So, but yeah, that's the only thing that kind of distracted me. And the ending when like he wouldn't die, and it's just like this little. It's just like, come on, just kick it away. It's not, he doesn't even have any hands. It's like it's a little toy with one foot that's burnt to a crisp. How can it even harm you at this point? You know, just like kick it away. The ending was just like really silly. I think the ending was a little too extended with the burnt up Chucky like terrorizing them, because it's like to pretend they had to like lay on the ground because if they stood up, it'd be like it's up to their shins. It's just like it's just
Yeah,
all it got really silly towards the end. But don't
yeah,
take it serious. It's a popcorn movie. Again, a lot of great scenes with like friend to the end and no batteries and
mhm,
hearing the doll curse for the first time and seeing the
yeah,
mother shocked and that it's alive. A lot of
yeah,
that stuff is really good. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I agree.
Friday the 13th, why not? You want to do that one next?
Absolutely, sure.
Okay.
Friday the
So
13th.
this is one that came out in 1980, a couple years after Halloween, but I think it was this and Halloween were looked at as the two movies that truly launched the golden age of slasher films. Very different. I'd like to get into how much this movie copies Twitch of the Death Nerve
Mhm,
slash Bay of Blood because I think it just ripped it off. But I'd like to probably maybe get into that when we talk about giallos, maybe.
mhm.
But this definitely is heavily giallo influenced, not just copying that movie, but the not seeing the killer in as far as creative angles and where the killer is killing people, showing you shots where you could see the people getting killed and the weapon, but not actually seeing the killer. I thought the cinematography was really good in the death scenes.
Mhm.
I thought the Tom Savini is
Yes.
yeah, he was a huge part of slasher films. He did a lot of the special effects, and he did the special effects for this one as well. I thought his special effects were great. It had a nice twist. The twist doesn't really make any sense because this old lady isn't throwing bodies around through windows and killing all these people, but it was still a nice twist. The only knock I have against this movie, again, a really fun popcorn movie. This is my favorite. This might maybe one of my favorite horror franchises, maybe only second to the Frankenstein franchise, but it's one of my favorite horror franchises. Definitely my favorite slasher horror franchise. The only thing that threw me off a little bit is the lead actress. Her acting was kind of like weird. Like some of her
Mhm.
acting choices is like, are you in a silent film or something? Like the way she was, especially the scenes like when she was alone, like she'd run away from the killer and then she just like sit down out of nowhere and just start like moving her hands around and looking around. I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Is this some kind of like art film type acting? But her acting, especially towards the end, was distractingly bad and weird. But aside from that, really fun movie, really fun deaths. I think this is maybe closest to a blueprint as you can get, as far as with the high body count, the sex, the person not having sex, living, twist ending, tragic backstory, mysterious killer, edged weapon, um, a puritanical lead actress, like all the boxes you can check as far as that goes. This one checks the most. And of course, you also have the iconic day. Now everyone's looking for Christmas and New Year's and Thanksgiving. This has the best of all because there's actually a Friday the 13th that only comes once a year, and this movie snapped up that title.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that this movie really brought to the genre was the killer that really has no MO. You know, the killer that uses a variety of different weapons to kill people. Because Michael Myers really kind of had a style. You know, he actually did a lot of strangling, which is surprising when you look at the movie again. He strangles a lot of people, but he also had a knife. And so it's the knife and the strangling. But Friday the 13th is a variety of different weapons. And it was so influential that even Halloween 2, they decided they had to go that way. And Michael Myers started using a variety of different ways to kill people. And that certainly became the thing in the slasher genre was almost no murder, no two murders in a slasher film are really alike. They always find a different way to kill the person.
I think part of that is having Tom Savini in there. Part of that is the fact that they copied a movie that had different creative deaths. I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of factors that go in there. I think later on they still stay creative in the franchise, but I think he does just kind of adapt to the machete at a certain point in the franchise
Yeah.
as his main weapon. But definitely, Michael isn't in this, only I guess towards the end. But he isn't the killer in this. So yeah, it's
No, no.
definitely all the deaths are different and super creative.
Yes. Yeah. And I had an experience where I actually saw Friday the 13th Part 3 before I ever saw Part 1 and Part 2. So I didn't realize that Jason wasn't the killer in Part 1. I didn't know that. And so when I watched Part
You
1,
see,
I just
if you were the heroine in Scream, you'd be dead because you'd say Jason's
exactly.
the killer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I watched the whole movie just thinking, oh, it's Jason, you know? And then when they revealed it's his mother, it was, oh my God, this was like a shocking twist and it really worked for me. You know, it was just absolutely shocking. I did not see that coming. But yeah, it's a great movie. It's a fun movie. Now, you know, when you said earlier you're not a fan of the Halloween franchise, I kind of agree. Like, I love Halloween, the original movie. I love it. And I would say it's better than Friday the 13th, the original movie. But the series, Friday the 13th, the series is just so consistent. And it's just, they do a better job of kind of doing what they do. Whereas the Halloween movies are kind of all over the map. They try all kinds of different things. And I don't think they work as well, the sequels, as the Friday the 13th. Not that that matters, but Friday the 13th is a very important movie because it launched all of those sequels, lots of rip-offs and spin-offs, including, you know, Freddy versus Jason and all that kind of stuff. But you know, it's definitely one of the movies that must be seen if you're interested in slasher films.
Yeah, I think it's because I agree. I agree. I completely agree with the last statement you made. If you're into slasher films, this is a series, and this is the movie and the series to watch because its focus is on the formula. That's all. This movie, the series. It's all about the formula, as opposed to Halloween, which is like it's about the characters, and it's just like, well, Michael has no motivation. But if you're gonna keep making these movies, you got to try and find motivation for him to keep it going. And it's about the characters. Well, how are you gonna keep shoehorning these characters in there? There's no story to tell. Well, and then you got to reboot the story and reboot the characters, and it's just like Friday the 13th doesn't do all that. They just have a new set of characters each time. The same shit happens just with different people, and it's just the formula. And they're not killing themselves trying to figure out, well, how we're gonna get Laurie into this, and how are we gonna figure out why Michael keeps trying to find Laurie, and why is Laurie still alive, and why is Michael still in this same town, and what's his motivation. It's like these filmmakers are making it too hard for themselves, whereas Friday the 13th, they're making it as easy for themselves as possible. Rinse, wash, repeat, So
Yes, absolutely.
A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Uh-huh.
This is, to me, this was kind of a borderline going into it. I'm like, is this a slasher? Is this more like a supernatural horror? I think you can say like a lot of the sequels definitely get more into the supernatural stuff, but I think after rewatching this, definitely a slasher. Partially supernatural horror, but definitely qualifies as a slasher. And it's brilliant. I mean, it doesn't have as much quipping as Krueger would have as it went along. It would be more about Freddy quipping and telling a lot of jokes. Here he had some one-liners, but he was kind of in the background as opposed to being like the main attraction. The main reason you're going to see the film eventually became Freddy Krueger. And I think that would, as the slasher films began to wane in popularity as you get into the mid 80s, I think that's when A Nightmare on Elm Street really got going. As people started to get tired of like the killer not talking, no motivation, just this brooding, unstoppable force, I think as, most of the slashers start to wane in popularity, I think that's when this franchise still stayed popular a little bit longer than some of the others, is because you had this charismatic guy that you were going to see that was a little bit different. He was funny, he was interesting, and he was also cool with the blades for hands like Wolverine or whatever. But yeah, I think he's definitely different than a lot of the others. Not so much in this one as much, but as it went on with the franchise. But yeah, you have young Johnny Depp in this one as well. But yeah, this was a fun one. A lot of the special effects were very creative. I do have another review that I did on this movie that's kind of extended, that gets into the things that I don't like. I won't focus on that there. If you want to see that, you'll see that in that review. But that review kind of focuses on the inconsistencies of what the rules are, because the rules are fast and loose. They make no sense on what he can do in the dream world and the real world. And you got to ignore all of that, because if you focus on that, man, there's no consistency as to like what the rules are, and you kind of want to establish the rules. But if you ignore that part of it, I think it's a great popcorn movie, and it started off a really entertaining franchise.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think this movie is kind of credited with breathing new life into the slasher genre, because it had been going for 6 years at this point, and people were getting tired of seeing the same old thing. And this movie kind of had a new idea, the killer who exists in your dreams, and he kills you in your dreams. And also the fact that he does speak and he does make jokes, although that was not as much in this one, as you said. But I think that's part of what makes this one work really well, is that you don't see him. At first, he's just kind of a shadow. You just see pieces of him. You don't get a good look at him until later in the movie. And of course, that's all gone. As soon as they make part two, they've got his face right on the cover, right on the poster. Whereas this movie, you don't see his face on the poster. You don't know who this guy is. You don't know what he looks like. And that makes him scarier. He's creepier in this movie than any of the sequels, I would say. Yeah. But yeah, I think this movie definitely worked really well, and huge success, obviously, spawned a bunch of sequels, a remake, a TV series called Freddy's Nightmares, and also I even have a record in my collection. I should have dragged it out for this, but I have a record with Freddy on the cover, and I don't want to say he sings, but he speaks during some of the songs. I'm going to have to dig that out and check it out again. You can probably find it on YouTube, but Freddy just became this cultural phenomenon. Yeah. People just loved him, and I guess for good reason. He was entertaining for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the special effects in this were really cool. I mean, you didn't have a lot of the Tom Savini type gore effects, but I think some of the supernatural effects were really good, especially as a kid. Seeing like the phone receiver, like a tongue sticks out, the whole blood pool from the Johnny Depp death scene. There was a lot of really cool, inventive. You could tell they were experimenting with a lot of stuff. A lot of great practical effects that weren't necessarily gory, but just supernatural tone and like the dream type feel to like what you were watching. I thought were really cool. And I thought that was a nice aspect of it as well, and a fun aspect. So we spent a lot of time in the 80s and late 70s, and let's go to one of the more modern slasher classics. So there's a lot of like movies that came out after the 90s that are really good. We only included one on our list. It's the last one. And you could have included like I Know What You Did Last Summer, maybe Candyman, maybe even some of the like really newer ones as well. But I feel like I think you agree as well. You kind of just set the stage with the one that kind of relaunched everything, and then from there you can then decide, hey, like I like the more self-aware slasher films, and then you can just use that as a launching point. And I think you made a good point as well, like you want to give a film time to see if it's an essential film. If they're too new, you don't really know if they're like really that essential to it. That's why we kind of mainly focused most of the films during that golden age, where it was really a movement, and we touched on some that came before, and and this one obviously came after, and I think everyone knows it's Scream. It has to be Scream. And again, we're talking about Wes Craven again, because we just talked about Wes Craven, who did Nightmare on Elm Street. The only thing I will say about Wes Craven that I don't like, the one thing I don't like, man, his villains are stupid. Like, they make some dumb choices. Like, again, I love the Nightmare on Elm Street, but that whole like Home Alone sequence at the end of A Nightmare on Elm Street really made Freddy look like an idiot. You know, like when he's getting caught with these Home Alone traps that she set up for him, and in the basement where like they're running around the stairs, and then she douses him with gasoline and sets him on fire. It's like he really came out to look like an idiot, and that's the only thing I don't like about the Scream movie, is that these bad guys really like beat themselves at the end, and the ending always like stuck out to me as like really bad. But aside from that, I mean, this breathed new life into the slasher genre, for another generation of people to rewatch the old classics, and also launching so many new stuff like Urban Legend. And I think the same writer of this wrote the I Know What You Did Last Summer. And those aren't just singular movies; those are franchises that were launched. And yeah, a lot of different movies were spawned from Scream, including Scream franchise itself. So, your thoughts?
Yeah, I loved Scream. I saw it in the theater when it first came out, and it just blew my mind. And I think I may have mentioned to you once before that a friend of mine, I told him to go see it, and after the opening sequence, he said I could have walked out of the theater at that point and felt like I'd had my money's worth. Like, that opening sequence alone was so great that the rest of the movie almost doesn't matter. But I think the movie's brilliant, and part of what I love about it is that it is kind of a satire of slasher films, but it's also kind of a slasher film. Like, it's kind of legitimately scary and suspenseful, but it's also funny. It's hilarious, and there are moments that I think are brilliant, like where Nev Campbell, Sidney Prescott, she says she doesn't watch horror films because they're always about big-breasted blonde women who run up the stairs when they should go out the front door. And then, of course, 2 minutes later, she's running up the stairs because she can't go out the front door. There's something blocking her. And I thought that was brilliant, right? So the movie was just so clever. And I agree the ending is probably not the strongest part of the movie, but I don't care by that point. I've enjoyed this movie so much, the ending almost doesn't matter to me. It's like, okay, that's fine. But I've enjoyed some of that stuff. And I mean, there's a great sequence in the movie where the characters are watching Halloween on TV, right? And the guy watching Halloween is yelling at the characters in Halloween and saying, look out behind you, look out behind you. And meanwhile, there's police watching him on surveillance, or I guess they're news people watching him on surveillance, and they're shouting at the screen, look out behind you, because the killer's behind him. I mean, moments like that I just think are absolute gold. And as a lifelong fan of slasher films, I think it just really worked for me. It just hit all the buttons. It made fun of things, but in a smart way. It was a smart movie. It wasn't a dumb spoof. It wasn't a dumb comedy. It was a very smart, funny film, I thought.
Yeah, it also reshifted some of the tropes with these movies, in that prior to this, you had Jason, you had Michael, you had Freddy. Those would be the consistent characters you'd keep coming back for. This kind of shifted it because Ghostface was different in every movie. It's the protagonist, Nev Campbell character, that you kept coming back for. And the killer would constantly change. There'd be a different Ghostface, where previous slasher movies, you keep coming back for the killer. It's like, oh, who's Michael gonna kill now? Who's Jason? Who's Freddy? Who's Chucky? Who are they gonna kill now? So it kind of shifted that, and it also shifted it from the gore and this is like very little sex, no nudity in these movies, and there's gore, but the gore isn't the selling point. So it shifted what you're going to the movie for. There's almost no drugs, very little alcohol, um, but all those things that you were previously going for, instead of going for that, now you're going for the stars, because suddenly horror movies, which hardly ever had stars, you now you're going for Nev Campbell, Drew Barrymore, and like suddenly you have all these young poppy at that time MTV type stars, and now it's like you have all these young up and coming young actors that you're going for the ensemble cast now. So I think this kind of shifted some of the tropes and some of the things that these type of slasher movies would go on to become.
Yeah, I think you're right. I hadn't even thought about it that way until you mentioned it a while back. That yeah, it's really Sidney Prescott and her friends who are the consistent characters, and the killer, while he looks the same, he's wearing the same outfit. He's not the same killer, and he has different motivations, depending on who it is. So yeah, that is very different. And interesting that when they tried that in Friday the 13th, Part 5, the audience hated it, right? They hated that it was not Jason, it's someone else in the Jason mask. So that quickly ended that idea, and we went back to Jason. But yeah, I loved Scream, and I think it holds up as a very good movie today.
All right, so let's get into some of these directors now. So we had a hard time with this in that, similar to our last list, where it's where we're doing the blaxploitation, where you have directors that do some great slasher movies, but they just kind of do one and they move on to other genres. But we did find a couple of directors that did multiple slasher movies, and multiple slasher movies that were actually good and worth watching and had a decent budget, weren't just like zero budget made for video or direct to video type films. Joseph Zito is the first one I'd like to start off with. Do you want to talk much about Joseph before we get into the films, or do you want to just go straight into his movies?
Well, I'll just say that he started out, I don't know a lot about him personally, but he may have made an adult film in 1971, but there's not much known about it if he did. And then he made a film called Abduction, which was kind of based on the true story of Patty Hearst, except it's fictionalized, so it's not Patty Hearst, but it's kind of that story, and it's an exploitation film, and it's quite a good film, I think. And then he did something called Blood Rage, which is not a slasher film exactly, but it's kind of in that sort of, it feels like a 70s, almost a proto slasher. It's more of a drive-in exploitation film where the guy does kill a couple of prostitutes, but it's not really quite a slasher film. It's something a little bit different, but it maybe predicts where he was going. And so Joseph Zito really emerged for me with one of my personal favorite slasher films, which is called The Prowler in 1981. And I love The Prowler. And part of what I love about it is somebody once asked the question, is there such a thing as a period piece slasher film? And the answer is basically no, there aren't really period pieces. But I immediately think of The Prowler because it starts out during World War II. And the first thing we see is an old newsreel from World War II. And we hear a Dear John letter, and we see the Dear John letter, which is written by somebody named Rosemary, but we don't see who she's writing to. And then we go to a sequence that takes place in 1945. The war has ended. The soldiers have come home, and there's a big dance. And it's quite an amazing sequence in that it's very believable that it's 1945. They've got multiple classic cars, like not just one, but they have multiple classic cars. And then they have a big dance going on where they have a live band playing music, and the room is packed full of people, all dressed in period costumes, and it looks like it's a lush, big budget production. It's not really, like, it's not a huge budget, but they somehow pulled off this really lush opening sequence. And then finally, when the first murder happens in 1945, it's so over the top. Like, the gore is so over the top, and it's from Tom Savini, who did Friday the 13th. He did The Prowler, and I think they're some of his best effects ever. And it's such an over-the-top, brutal kill that it just makes it clear right away that this is the kind of movie we're watching. Right? We're watching a slasher film that's going to deliver some really impressive gore. And I think on a personal level, this was a movie that I saw when I was young, and the gore was intact. You know, the gore was still there on the VHS tape that I saw. Whereas other movies like The Burning, which Tom Savini did, the gore had all been cut out. It had all been censored. And so it took years for us to be able to finally see what Tom Savini had really done in that movie. But The Prowler, for some reason, survived. And we got to see those special effects. They were still there. And the other things that I really like about The Prowler, the final girl, if I can use that term, the sort of female lead of the movie, she's a great character, and she is a very active final girl. She's not just somebody waiting around to, you know, become a victim. And it's very interesting because most slasher films, often the end of the first act is where the first killing occurs. I mean, other than the sort of background killing, like at the beginning of Halloween. But, you know, often that's where the murders begin, after we've set up all the characters and the situations. But in this movie, they kill people a little bit sooner than that. And then toward the end of Act 1, the main character, the final girl, who I think her name is Pam, she goes back to her dorm room, and we know that there's been a murder there, right? We know somebody's dead, but she runs into the killer and is immediately chased by the killer, which is very unusual for a slasher film. Usually the final girl does not wind up running afoul of the killer until the final act, and there's a big sequence there, but she actually confronts the killer in the first act and is chased. And then the second act of the film becomes about her kind of investigating and trying to figure out what's going on here. And she teams up with the deputy sheriff, who's kind of like her love interest, and she has to convince him that there's something wrong here. And she does a good job of it. She's smarter than him about putting the mystery together. And there's a moment in the film where they go in to investigate a house, and she's wearing his jacket because she's cold. And it kind of gives you the impression that she has been accepted now almost as his deputy because she's wearing his deputy jacket. But it's very different from, I think, a lot of other slasher films in that we have this kind of storyline where she's investigating and she's taking action, and she's not just partying and drinking and waiting for the killer to attack her, as we would see in so many other films. I could go on and on about this movie, but the last thing I'll say for now is that the other thing that really worked for me in this movie was the mystery, because so many of them don't work. You know, it's so obvious who the killer is, but this movie really fooled me. I did not know who the killer was. And I remember screening it later for a friend of mine who's very picky and not necessarily a fan of slashers. And he did not figure out who the killer was either until the very last second, right before they unmasked the killer. So I think it is a very well-made movie. I think it's very good. And it actually apparently somebody from the Friday the 13th, the producers of Friday the 13th, somebody saw this movie and said to Joseph Zito, "This is a really good movie, and it's too bad it won't earn as much money as it should. If you could call it Friday the 13th, it would earn a lot of money. But if we do another one, we're going to call you, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But what are your thoughts about The Prowler?"
After hearing all that, I almost feel bad that I don't like it. Because you seem so passionate about it. But I think this is going to be a Black Christmas situation where I think you kind of have more of an affinity for the film than I do. It was not one of my favorites. I wanted to get into it. The whole story with the deputy that wanted to prove that he could be a good cop, that didn't really go anywhere because it would have been better if he was played maybe like Dewey in Scream, where it's just like he's this bumbling idiot and then he finally does something right. It's just like he does a good job, but the story is supposed to be like he doesn't. So you hear people talk down to him, but it's like, what is he actually doing that's bad, So it's like I think they wanted a story there, but they didn't really execute it great. And I didn't really care about any of the characters that got killed, so I wasn't really invested there. Um, the old guy in the wheelchair, that didn't really go anywhere either, as far as like that subplot with him. Like, did he have something to do with it? Did he who knew the killer was? It's like, where did that go? That didn't really go anywhere. And I kind of saw the twist coming even the first time I saw it. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go out of town, make sure everything's good. I'm like, he's the killer. Yeah, he's the killer. He's the killer. It's like they kind of emphasize him going out of town so much. It's like, why are you harping on this so much, And the fact that there were no other male characters that could have been the killer. It's like, who else could it have been? There are three main characters: the deputy, the old guy in the wheelchair, and the guy that's emphasizing, I'm not gonna be here. I'm gonna be out of town, okay? So if anything crazy happens, I'm not here while it happens. It's like, yeah, like you're the killer, dude. There's three people it could be. It's not the old guy in the wheelchair. It's not the main guy that we're following. It's you. But I didn't think it was bad. I mean, I think it's definitely worth watching. I enjoyed it on a watch, but on the list of films we watch, it's probably lower on the list for me than some of the others. But I mean, based on the way you were describing it and talking about it, man, you really hyped me up. If I didn't see this movie, if I never saw it, I'd be like, I gotta watch that film based on how you hyped it up. I would have been like, yeah, I gotta get my hands on this. So yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I had.
Well, that's interesting, and you're not alone. There are people who don't like it, but I do love it, and I think part of the reason why the guy's leaving town and all that, it's because we're leaving this sort of inexperienced deputy in charge who's not going to be able to handle things. So I think that's kind of where that's coming from.
But they should have made him more. They should have showed more like how overwhelming it was for him. Like, I get that setup, but they didn't really do anything with the setup of that,
True. But I think we do see that the girl Pam, she's better at the job than him. She's better at just solving.
They should just focus on like that. Develop her more instead of like this subplot with this guy that goes nowhere. Just more time with Pam, because she was an interesting character. Just with Pam, I think they could have done more with her because they focused on her being jealous of him dancing with some other girl. It's like, we already know that the girl pulled him over there and he's not cheating. Maybe if he was actually cheating or if he was tempted to cheat, it just kind of make her look bad by having that subplot in there. It was just like, give the guy a break. He didn't do anything wrong. It's like, why are you setting us up to dislike the main character? Like, why have that subplot where she's jealous of him for no reason? If she's going to be jealous of him, have it portrayed in a way to make us root for him. It's like, yeah, he's cheating on her. Like, come on, get away from him. He's not good for you. Or it's like, you know, have it set up in a way it's like where you want to root for her. It's like her being jealous of him, and it's clear he did nothing wrong, makes me dislike her. Why set it up that I'm gonna dislike her? It's like, because I'm a guy. Like, you know, your girl gets jealous and you didn't do anything wrong, you can be like, stop busting my balls. You know, it's like, I'm not gonna root for you for that. It's like, you know, it's like, I empathize with the guy. It's like, Jesus Christ, like, you know, get some self-esteem. Like, a girl looks at me and I gotta apologize because she came on to me even though I didn't do anything. Yeah, I don't know, but I just felt like the subplots that they tried to do kind of backfired. They didn't have to make her the jealous girlfriend, and they didn't have to make him the bumbling idiot. And if they were gonna do that, they should have executed those two things better. And those were the only things they really did to develop those characters. Like, what else did they do to give those characters personalities? You know, the personality for her, she's a jealous girlfriend. The personality for him is that he's in over his head. Where did those two subplots go?
Well, I see her as more the investigator. You know, she's the one who kind of knows there's something going on. There's a prowler, and she kind of gets to the bottom of it. So I don't think of her as the jealous girlfriend. I think of her as the
But you're
investigator.
saying
But
you're saying what she did do, but
yes,
that's not her. That's not a personality. That's just things that she's doing. You know, that's not her personality. It's like that's just literally what she did throughout the film. But the personality that they gave her was his jealous girlfriend. And then, you know, she gets something spilled in her dress and she's all pissy and she's got to go home and change. And like, oh my God, like he's cheating on me. Like, oh my God, like I got to get out of here. And like, I got to leave this dance. And, you know, like there were like 3 or 4 scenes where they could have developed some kind of personality for her. I agree. Like the investigating part, she was a strong character in that. But again, that's not personality. When they had a chance to develop her personality, there were like 3 or 4 scenes that they completely wasted, where it's just her being jealous. I think she was putting up some sign in the first scene we saw her, and then some other girl said hi to him, and she was pissy about that. And then he goes to the dance to go with her, and some other girl pulls him across. She gets pissy about that. It's like, why are we wasting scenes of that stuff when we could be developing her? Like, let us know something about her to make us root for her. You know, make her like, you know, like her mother didn't think she should go off to college because she should stay home and help her, and you know, she's leaving her mother and she has like, oh man, should I have stayed home with my mother? Should I be off at college trying to make something of this? I'm not saying that should be the subplot, but something more interesting than jealous girlfriend, you know? I don't know.
yeah, well, fair enough. But I think again, in conclusion, um, the movie is lush. You know, the production values are amazing.
I agree with all of
Y-
that.
You
It
know,
did give a
even
lot of effort that most
yeah,
of these quickie slasher films that are just trying to like, oh, birthdays and graduation. It's like they did go above and beyond what you would expect for a movie
yeah,
like this
yeah.
in
I mean,
those opening sequences.
yeah, and I mean not just in the 1945 sequence, but even later when they show the modern day dance, it's a packed place, and they've got a live band playing. You know, like they've really gone to a lot of trouble here. It's not just 3 people in the woods. You know, there's a huge crowd of people there. Um, and the special effects, I still say, are some of Tom Savini's best.
Mhm.
And I know people talk about the famous gunshot to the head scene in Maniac.
Mhm.
But there's a gunshot to the head in this movie that I think is every bit as good as the gunshot to the head in Maniac. So, you know, just for people who love Tom Savini and who love that kind of gore, practical effects, I think this is one of the best examples of that in the golden age of slasher films.
Well, speaking of Tom Savini and Joseph Zito, this is a film that I like better from the two of them. And it's again, it's from a franchise that I love, Friday the 13th and the final chapter. Yeah, the final chapter. They
Yes,
made like 20 films after this. Um, but yeah,
yes.
this is a film that I loved. I'll let you go first, but I this
Yeah,
film great.
yeah. Well, you know, like I said before, somebody had come and seen The Prowler and had been really impressed by it. And they had just finished Friday the 13th, part 3. And they said, well, if we do a 4, we'll give you a call. And so they sure did. And a lot of people feel that part 4 is the best of the sequels. And I don't disagree. I mean, for years, I had the VHS tape of the original Friday the 13th, and the only other one I had was part 4. I loved those 2 movies. And I know a lot of people who love part 4 and say it is the best. But one thing I noticed right away is there's a really cool prologue at the beginning of part 4 where they show you scenes from all the previous 3 movies. And it's
I think
great,
they showed you that because maybe they actually in their hearts felt this was going to be the last one.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is kind of telling us this is it. This is the final chapter. We're finally wrapping it up. And it's such a good montage that it makes me want to watch all those 3 movies again as soon as I watch that opening sequence.
20 years later, they're still making more movies.
Oh God, yeah. I think that after the credits, we get this scene with the helicopter and the police vehicles, and they take it. Basically picks up at the end of part 3 where Jason was supposedly killed, and they take his body to I guess a hospital morgue, and this is actually interesting because again there was a lot of production value there in terms of all the the rescue personnel and the vehicles and all that stuff. But it's also one of the few times that we see Jason outside of that Camp Crystal Lake or outside of the wilderness setting. They go to this hospital, and I thought that was very interesting and very well done. But the thing that I think is really great about part 4 is that the characters are all pretty much likable, and they're all pretty well developed. And I actually, just by coincidence, I happened to watch part 7 just recently on Friday the 13th, in fact. And they're very similar movies in terms of their setup, because in part 4, you've got 2 houses. I hesitate to call them cabins because they look more like 2 houses that are kind of next to each other at Crystal Lake. And in the one house, you've got a mom, and you've got a teenage daughter, and a 12-year-old boy, and a dog. And that's part 4. And in part 7, you've also got the 2 houses side by side. And in the one house, you've got the mom and the teenage daughter and her psychiatrist. So it's a little bit different that way. But so in both films, the other house is full of teenagers or young people who have rented the house to party. And so you've got the house with a family and then the house of the partying teenagers. So very, very similar setup.
It's funny when you say that. When I started watching this movie, because it's been a while since I've seen it, I'm like, where's the psychiatrist going to come in? It's like, that's the first thing that I'm like, man, well, like, when's the psychiatrist going to come in? And didn't this girl have like psychic powers? Like, when is that going to start?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's not this movie. Yeah.
No, that's part 7.
Yeah.
No, but honestly, like, as much as I enjoy part 7, I could really see the difference. In part 4, the characters were much more well developed, and they were much more likable. Like, there were a lot of little subplots going on. And one of the most, I guess, talked about would be Crispin Glover, who plays a character in part 4. Crispin Glover, who would go on to fame and fortune in movies like Back to the Future and The Doors. He played Andy Warhol and many other movies. But I love Crispin Glover, but that's a whole other story. Mm-hmm. But in this movie, he plays a guy who his friend sort of tells him that he's a dead fuck.
Yeah, that's
the quote. And so anyway, he's kind of a sympathetic guy, and he has a whole subplot going on where he's like, insecure, and he winds up actually meeting a girl, and you know, but I mean, it's just so much more. There's so much more drama going on in this movie than in a lot of other slasher films, and even other Friday the 13th movies. Even Part 7, you know, where we've got the similar setup, I find the characters to be less likable in that movie than the ones in Part 4. So, anyway, I'm sure I could say many other things, but let me just throw it over to you and say, what are your feelings about Part 4?
Oh, God, I love this. I love this for reasons that people may hate it. I love this because uh it's so gratuitous. It's like, all right, we got a bunch of teenagers for no reason that are just gonna be next door, and they're all gonna get killed off, and they're there for no. I love how meaningless and how little they serve the plot. They're just there because we need bodies to kill. And you know what? That's not enough bodies. We need more bodies to kill, and we need more nudity, and we need more sex, and we need more girls. So here are these two twins that came out of nowhere for no reason. They just pop out. I can see the writers' room saying, "Okay, we need more girls." Okay, these two twins come out of nowhere, and they're just like super hot and horny, and they just have sex with our side characters. I just love how randomly those twins come into the movie and just like have sex with these guys and just add more sex and nudity, and they immediately take off their clothes and go skinny dipping. I love that aspect of it. That's why I love this franchise. It's just because it knows what it's about. It's not trying to do any more, any less. Um, I love the fact that this is the start of the Tommy Jarvis trilogy, where a different actor plays Tommy Jarvis for 3 straight movies, and he's supposed to be the next Jason and the next serial killer. I love that little foreshadowing where she's like, "You need to get a haircut," and then that plays into the end where he cuts off all his hair to look like Jason. What else do I love? I love the trope that's in a lot of slasher movies that this just says, you know what? In slasher movies, you get people that get thrown through windows. Why don't we do that 87 times where people are just like thrown through windows? Like, what are these windows made of? But like, I think there's probably like 8 windows in that house that the teenagers are in. I think someone gets thrown through every single one of those windows. I think one person even multiple times. And landing on those crash pads where you see they land and they bounce. It's like, I just find it all. I just love all those aspects of it: the nudity, the sex, the drugs, the high body count, the characters that just come out of nowhere. Even that guy who just the guy who fixes the car. It's like, where are these people living? They're in the middle of nowhere. And like, you have twins coming out of nowhere. You have guy coming to fix your car as soon as it breaks down. It's like, you're not in the middle of the city. You're in the middle of nowhere. Like, how are you bumping into all these people? So, it's just so many aspects of this film that I love. It's so cheesy. It's so funny. It's so entertaining. And again, it knows what it is. The effects are great. The execution is on point, and I just love it.
Yeah, and actually, that's a point I should have made too. Is that Tom Savini, who did the special effects for the original Friday the 13th, and then turned down Part 2 because he thought Part 2 sounded like a dumb idea. You know, they said, "Hey, we're going to do a Part 2, and it's going to be about Jason being the killer," and he said, "Well, that's stupid because Jason died even before Part 1 starts. That doesn't make any sense." So he decided not to do Part 2. And he also didn't do Part 3, but he came back because this was the final chapter, right? So he came back, and so the special effects are once again second to none, thanks to Tom Savini. And yeah, Tommy Jarvis, that's another thing, played by what's his name, Corey Feldman, one of the two Coreys who made a bunch of movies together. That character's great and sympathetic and colorful and interesting, and the guy who you referred to, who's sort of like the love interest for Tommy's sister,
What an
He's an
idiot that
interesting.
guy was. I like how he goes down in the basement. He's like, "Run! I've got him! I've
Yeah,
got him!" I think
yeah,
he drops something and he goes back. And I don't know
yeah.
if they did this on purpose or if this was just like they thought they were being serious. But he was like, "Oh my God, he's killing me! Oh, it hurts so bad! Oh, he's killing me! Oh, I'm dying!" It's like, just his
Yeah.
dialogue in the basement when he's getting killed was just so hilarious.
He's an example of a type of character that you see in some horror films. I call it the expert who comes in knowing what is to be known about the evil, and he's there to sort of defeat the evil, but he winds up getting his ass kicked. And he's really no use to us in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually, when I first saw the movie, I thought, yeah, that's a terrible character. I didn't like him because I felt he just came in. He was there to kill Jason. He knew all about Jason. I think they claimed his sister was killed by Jason or something, or his brother. I can't remember.
Mm-hmm.
So he's there for the job of killing Jason, and he's brought weapons and what. But he doesn't do anything really. Like he's not successful in any way at defeating Jason. As you said,
this character though, it's executed the way these characters are always executed. I believe the priest in The Exorcist, the expert priest, didn't he get killed pretty quickly, and he got killed off screen. I think The Shining, Catman Struthers, where he comes back, he gets killed off like nothing. I think even in The Stepfather, there's a character where it's like, hey, he killed my previous family or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
That's how these characters always end up. It's like,
oh, I know.
I'm here to save the day. No, I'm not. I'm dead.
I know, and it sort of drives me crazy. But I must say though, watching the movie again, I was pleasantly surprised at how that character actually had a fair bit to do, and he was not just. I remembered him just showing up and getting killed really fast, but he's actually there for quite a while, and he does a few things. So I actually don't mind him as a character, but I've always had a bit of a pet peeve or whatever about these characters who are supposed to be experts and they just come in and die.
I don't know. I think you need to, if you have a copy of the film, rewatch his death scene. I don't remember exactly what the dialogue was. Maybe I'm remembering it differently in my head. But I just remember, like, I think he dropped something. He's like, I'm going to go back and get it. And she was like, no, don't. And he said, no, I got it. Yeah. He's like, oh my God, he's killing me. I'm dying. Oh, the pain. I forgot exactly what he said, but in my mind, that's what he said. I just find it so hilarious. But and again, this movie is so great because he chases Corey's sister up the stairs in the one building, and then she jumps out the window, and then he chases her up the stairs in the other building. It's like he's just repeating everything. Like oh man, this movie is so great. This movie is so great.
Oh, I love it. I think it's definitely one of the best Friday the 13th movies. Possibly the best, but it's definitely one of the best. And so, I think that Joseph Zito, for my taste, he made two of my favorite slasher films, and they were both fairly successful, which really makes me wonder, why they didn't ask him to do part 5, or maybe they did, and he said, no, I'm not sure. But after he made this movie, he went on to basically just do 3 action films, 2 of them with Chuck Norris. He did Missing in Action and Invasion USA, which were both big hits. And then he did Red Scorpion with Dolph Lundgren, which was a big expensive movie that flopped. And that kind of ended his career until the well, after the year 2000, I think. But I still feel like it's too bad that he got out of slasher films or out of horror, because I think he could have done some more good films. But I don't know. I guess he just moved on,
Hmm.
as so
Yeah.
many people do.
Well, he left us with a really good one there. So
He did. He
yeah.
did. Yeah.
Okay. Any you want to say a few words about Fred Walton?
Well, Fred Walton, of course. I don't know a lot about him as a person, but he made a couple of films that I do really like, and actually, he made a lot of films. I think he did have quite a successful career
Hmm.
making films, but again, not that many that we can say are true slasher films.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm sure you'll talk about um, the films in detail, but yeah, they're definitely films that stick out for me, as I certainly remember from my childhood or my youth, and I remember them quite fondly. So
Hmm. Yeah. So again, with these director spotlights, sometimes it's hard to get a director that fits into the criteria what we're looking for. And it's not just about getting a great director, it's just about spotlighting maybe a director and some of his films that maybe you're not familiar with, so you can maybe just get familiar with his work. So Fred Walton, obviously not a prolific or historic filmmaker, but definitely an interesting one. And let's get into some of his films that meet the criteria. We're going to get into three of them, two that meet the criteria, and one that's a sequel for a movie that made the criteria. So let's
yes,
start off with When a Stranger Calls. So this was actually a really successful film, box office hit, and it was all based on the opening sequence. And this opening sequence was again reused for Scream, which again, it had the benefit of doing it what in 96, and this came out in like 79, so we're talking about 17 years later to perfect it. So I obviously we all, I think everyone agrees Scream executed it better, but again, this came 17 years earlier and this originally did it. But that opening sequence I think was great, the best part of the movie by far. You can actually argue like the opening sequence was a horror movie. Maybe the final act was a horror movie, but the middle of it was kind of like police investigation type film. It almost didn't feel like a horror movie for the middle part of the movie, but definitely felt like a horror at the beginning and the end. The opening sequence where the killer's in the house, again, something that Black Christmas did a few years prior as well. But I think, it's obviously a very memorable opening sequence and well executed. Again, executed better later on, but executed well enough. And not a big fan of the middle part of the film because I wasn't really sure who the main character was supposed to be. Um, you think it would be the babysitter based on the opening sequence, but then she leaves the movie until the end, and she kind of bookmarks it. So we
mhm,
see her at the beginning, we see her at the end, in the middle of the movie, she's nowhere to be found. Then you have the cop that comes in, where you think he'd be a side character, then he's kind of like the main character we're following. And then instead of incorporating, I thought they missed the mark, where it's like the killer ends up stalking and following a random woman at a bar, and she becomes like one of the main characters for a while. You figure with all these characters, maybe have him stalk the mother of the kids that he killed, so at least it kind of ties in a little bit. But it feels like we're following a lot of random characters. It's like, who's supposed to be the main character? The babysitter, the barfly, the killer, the investigator. It just feels like the movie lacked a little bit of a focus to me. So I didn't really love the middle part, but definitely the beginning and the end to me really worked out well, and those felt more like a horror movie than anything else. But what are your thoughts?
yeah. Well, fairly similar. I remember this from when it first came out, and I saw the TV commercials, and and I thought, oh man, I really want to see this movie. This looks so great. And when I finally saw it, I was amazed that it was really just the first, 20 minutes or so was the movie that I kind of expected it to be, and it was great. That part was great, and then it gets weird in the middle, and I think I've said in the past that it's one of the most strangely structured films ever made, because it's almost like different movies. You got this fairly complete film at the beginning, and then you've got this whole other movie starting in the middle, and you're right that it's a totally different main character, and you don't really know where it's going, and in a way that the killer almost becomes sympathetic in that sequence because he's being treated so badly everywhere he goes, and it's kind of like a statement on the mental health system or something, where they're letting these guys out but they really don't have anywhere to go. So it gets very strange in there, and it almost becomes more like a weird vigilante story where the cop is maybe going to kill him just to get rid of him, going to go outside the law. But then, of course, we do finally come back, and Carol Kane returns, and it's supposed to be, 7 years later or something like that. So she's now married, and she's got kids, and in a way, it's kind of like the reverse of the opening sequence, because the same thing kind of happens again, except instead of focusing on the babysitter, we're now focusing on the mother who's in the restaurant while this thing is happening with her babysitter and kids at home. So it's like showing us the flip side of the first part of the movie. Having said all of that, I think it all kind of works in a strange way. I kind of like it, like it's, I think when I first saw it, I didn't really get it in a way, but I think the more I watch it over time, the more I just appreciate it for being this really odd thing that it is. And it's in a way not really much of a slasher film because there's not much killing at all, right?
No.
And it happens off screen,
yeah.
But it was very much part of that. It came out at sort of just as the genre was exploding, and it certainly got advertised, and I think people were going to it with that in mind, and I certainly always thought of it as a slasher film. But when you really look at it, it's like, well, it's almost not, it's almost something else.
It doesn't have the slasher aspect of it as far as the killer, the edge weapon stuff, but you do have the mysterious killer, you do have the babysitter, you do have the woman in peril. So you do have a lot of the elements there. Not all of them, but you do have enough where you could categorize it that way. Eh, but yeah, it's an odd movie.
Yeah.
And I the thing that confused me the most is why make us sympathetic towards the killer? It's just you're right. It seemed like it almost like, is this a popcorn movie, or is it trying to make a statement on mental health, like you said? And then is this a popcorn movie, or is this making a statement on trauma and how trauma affects you in the rest of your life? With the way she's the way she has that breakdown in the restaurant, and no one will believe her, and the police investigative stuff. It's weird. It's weird. I'm not saying it doesn't work. It works in a way, but it's also it is weird. The choices that were made. I didn't get it. That kind of, unless you have any more to say, I want to get into the sequel as well. Did you have anything more to say about that?
No, the only thing I would say is that when they did the remake, they made the whole film about the first 20 minutes. So they got rid of all the rest of it. They just focused totally on that first 20 minutes. So
that makes more sense. I haven't seen the remake, but that would make more sense to do.
Yeah.
But as far as the sequel goes, so the sequel, it falls into the same trap. It's like, who's the main character? You have the babysitter again, but Carol, is that the Carol King? Is that the actress's name?
Carol Kane. Yeah.
Carol Kane. So and then you have Carol Kane. It's like, okay, is she going to be the main character? Are you going to mention anything about her kids and her husband? Did this trauma make her divorce? There's no mention that she has a family. Then you have the investigator back again. Who's the main character? And it's a TV movie, and it has all the feel and the tone and the set. TV movies, they just make me laugh out loud sometimes. It's like she's in a coma. She's been shot. It's like,
Yeah.
God, that's such a TV movie thing to do. And then to me, the most hilarious thing in the movie, this made me laugh out loud to myself in the room as I'm watching this, where she's in the bed in a coma, the babysitter in the sequel, after she shoots herself in the head off screen, trying to kill herself. And out of the shadows in her hospital room comes the killer. And he just starts punching her. He just starts. I think he starts poking her to see if she's really in a coma and alive. He just starts punching her and punching her while she's in a coma, and then he disappears into the shadows again. It's just like, oh my god, this is so stupid and so funny at the same time. And he's a ventriloquist. First of all, he's a ventriloquist. What?
Yeah.
And how the hell does? First of all, make him a ventriloquist is one thing. But how does the investigator come and says, there's only one answer? He must be a ventriloquist?
Yeah.
Who would guess that? Who would say, yeah, he must be a ventriloquist? How do you come up with that? Like, how do you draw that conclusion? Like, there's only one reason, there's only... I don't know, man.
This is gonna sound crazy, but we're looking for a ventriloquist.
Part of me feels like this is a comedy because it's the conclusions that they draw is just so over the top, and oh man. And he's in the blackface, and then you have the bodybuilder topless chick in there. I'm like, topless? I thought it was the topless bar. I thought it was made for TV. I don't know how the topless came into it. But yeah, he's in the blackface. It's just like some weird choices. And how does he paint himself in the end to look like the bricks? Like, how does that happen? Like,
no, that's ridiculous.
Talk about a stretch of like.
Yeah, it was quite something.
I don't know, man. It's just a weird fucking movie, man. It works as a comedy. It works as a comedy, but it was just one of the strangest movies I've ever seen. But I would say it's worth watching as a comedy. I would say the original, it's barely worth watching because it barely fits into a slasher. It has some of it, but not a lot. But you said if the remake, I haven't seen the remake, but if the remake focuses on what the first 20 minutes is, I say maybe stick to the remake, or maybe just watch Scream, or even Black Christmas, who does the Killers in the House thing better. But not a high recommend for the first one. A recommend for the sequel just for comedy purposes. But do you have anything to say about I haven't let you say anything about the sequel, please.
Well, you know, I think the one thing that I thought was kind of good about it was that it's kind of, in a way, they set up the same situation at the beginning where she's the babysitter in the house. But I like the fact that they kind of chose to do it differently. So it's not that he's phoning her, he's actually at the door, right? And he's knocking on the door and the phone is actually disconnected. So I thought that was kind of clever that they didn't just repeat the same thing again. They found a different way to do it. But I agree that the ventriloquism thing is a little bit out there, you know, to say the least. I thought they were going to say he had some kind of radio controlled device or something that he was speaking through, but no, he's a ventriloquist.
And the fact that he would say, the fact that to me, the funniest part is like, there's only one answer.
We're looking for a ventriloquist.
He's got to be a ventriloquist.
Yeah. Well, that's the instincts of a cop who's been on the job for 40 years. You know, he's very good at figuring these things out.
There's only one answer, man. Only one answer. Oh God. Okay. April Fools. I thought this movie had a chance to be really good. In the sense that, again, you have the theme. When all these filmmakers, oh man, we got to get a theme. This was their theme, April Fools. So you got to know there's going to be an April Fool's twist in there. I thought that this movie could have been saved or good is if it was all a joke, except someone didn't realize it was a joke. It's like, oh, I didn't know you were, and then they actually killed someone for real. And it's like, oh my God, the joke turned horribly wrong. I thought that could have been a way to make this premise work. It's a joke, and the whole joke turned terribly wrong because someone wasn't in on the joke and they didn't know. But the fact that it stayed a joke for the whole movie, it really rubbed me the wrong way. Yeah, it didn't work for me.
Yeah. Well, I think I once read a review that said, slasher fans don't mind being cheated if it's in a clever way. But this movie isn't quite clever enough about the way that it cheats us, I think that it's a fairly entertaining movie. I think that it is hard to buy the premise, that it's
Not
all
just
a
that,
joke.
like the lead character, like she goes from like happy and like jovial to like the next morning she's like depressed and mopey, and it's like, where's the transition? Like,
Yeah.
it didn't make any sense. It felt like maybe 20 minutes was cut out the movie where she transitioned from like this happy jovial person to this depressed mopey character. It's just like, how did that happen? Why did that happen? That made no sense. Aside from the twist being terrible, the transition of her character didn't really work for me. Like, what did you think about that?
Well, I think I thought it was strange. Now, is this, I'm trying to remember now because it's been a while since I watched this, but the twist that eventually comes, is there a revelation?
She brings them out to an island that she inherited, and she has to find a way to have the upkeep. Her family is rich to have it,
Right.
but there's upkeep for the island. So her idea is to do these April Fool's thing, but she wanted to test it out on her friend. So she'd pretend to kill them, and then after she pretended, then they'd be in on it, and they'd help her to pretend to kill the next person, and then they'd be in on it, etc., etc. But when she gets them all there, they're all happy and jovial, and she's happy and jovial. And then the next morning, her character, she turns into a completely different person, where she's just like mopey and doesn't want to talk to them, and she has no makeup on, and her hair is all frizzy, and she's running from them. Like when the sunlight comes out, she's like, "Oh, don't look at me!" And it's like her personality completely changes. It made no sense,
Yeah, but now, am I remembering right though that there's a twist that comes later on where we actually find out that she has a sister or a twin or something like that? Is it that
so
they've actually,
one of the last few people to get killed, they see this false evidence that was planted saying she has a sister, explaining why where I think her name was like Moppy or Mopey or something, or Muffy. Her name was like Muffy and her sister was Buffy or something like that. Some stupid thing like that. Oh, this isn't Muffy, this is Buffy, her twin sister. So I guess that was to explain the switch in her character, and it's still being it didn't pay off enough. But that was the explanation for the change. And one of the last people to get killed saw that, but it was just fake planted evidence. And then eventually they get killed, and then it's a surprise, hey, none of us are really dead. So to me, it could have been saved if it's like, it's all a joke, that someone really gets killed in the midst of the joking. And then at the end, when it's like another twist comes where someone's about to kill her, but then it's another joke at the end, and none of it worked for me. None of it worked.
Well, it's definitely not quite the movie that it should have been or could have been. I still think it's fairly entertaining in its own way, but it doesn't quite hang together in the end. It's not quite satisfying. But it's still an enjoyable watch, I think.
I think if you watch the others and you like slashers and you don't want to rewatch Friday the 13th for the 18th time, it's like this is probably, I wouldn't put it above a lot of other slashers, but I would put it in a category where it's like instead of rewatching the same movie over and over again, this has a lot of the same beats. It's not executed as well, but I think it's better to watch this and to rewatch another slasher over and over again. If you have like a Jones or a fix for slasher movies, or if you're doing like a slasher marathon, or you're watching a bunch of horror
Yeah,
movies, like watching this instead of rewatching another movie again, I think that's where this would come into play. Is if you
yeah,
want to watch more slashers, but it's kind of lower on the list. But it's not bad completely. It's the
no,
twist that makes it bad, and also
yeah,
the execution of the character. The lead character didn't really make a lot of sense. There's a couple of execution things that didn't work, but the
yeah,
gore scenes were fine. There's a lot to like about the movie, but the execution of certain things makes you it leaves a sour taste in your mouth.
yeah. Well, it leaves you feeling a bit cheated that this was all a joke. This none of this happened, right?
Yeah,
So it's kind of like, what was the point of watching all of this? And you don't really buy it. Like some of those moments are so complicated that how could they have done that? How could they have faked it so well, right?
yeah,
But
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it's yeah. I think you can enjoy it for what it is, and ultimately, it probably won't be as satisfying as many of the other films that we've talked about.
But we've given a lot of good films to watch, I think.
Yes.
So, who's not familiar with the slasher films or is familiar with some but may not be familiar with everything we mentioned? I think there's a lot of films here that we've given that are great watches. I mean, towards the top of my list would definitely be Peeping Tom. And then from there, stuff like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw, Halloween. Um, all great movies. And as far as the popcorn movies go, Child's Play, all of the Friday the 13th films, Scream, Nightmare on Elm Street. There's a lot of good movies on this list. And yeah, I mean this was a lot of fun. I mean,
Yeah.
this took us a long time to do. Some of these movies I watched a long time ago,
Yeah.
but it's good talking about them again. Makes me remember them. So it was
Yeah.
just a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you made a good point earlier that, these may not be all of the best movies in the genre, and they
Mhm.
may not even be our personal favorites, but these are some of the ones that are essential if you want to understand the genre. Some of the most popular and iconic films are on this list. And I think if you're interested, you need to watch these ones. And then maybe another time we'll talk about slasher films that are more obscure that we really like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I definitely like to revisit this because it's one of my favorite. I love horror movies, and this is one of my favorite subgenres in the horror movie category. So,
Yeah.
any other final thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, I don't think so. I'm sure I'll think of something 5 minutes later, but and I'm sure there are many things that we didn't say that we could have said. But I think this is a good starting point, and I think there's a lot more to be discovered here. But perhaps that'll be for another day.
Yeah, and a lot of these franchises and films are being redone, and they're about to be redone for a third time. But it's always good to check out the originals and see what started it all. So
Yeah.
definitely check these out.